Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917, you really have to go back and look at this period to get an idea of where Mexico is now. This is a burned out sugar mill which was destroyed by Zapata's rebels just south of Mexico City in the state of Morelos. Up until this period, there had been a dictatorship with extreme concentration of wealth and with most of the economy centered on rural agriculture. Zapata started the revolution in the south and completely broke the old system and led to a new government. But what happened was that there were faction fights between the different groups in the revolution, and the faction which finally came out on top was not Zapata, who was killed by the other revolutionaries, but another general named Carranza, who set up a government very much aimed at modern development and progress.
We have a next one? Okay. There we go.
And here you can see the churchyard where Zapata was elected as president of his village defense. And although Zapata and almost 1 million others died in the course of the revolution, we can see in Mexico that their efforts were largely in vain, simply because the peasant for whom the revolution was fought has, in most cases, not had his life improved very much. And here you can see, just as an example, the little town of Morelos, Aneniquilco, where Zapata was born and grew up. And this is very typical of so many rural towns in Mexico, that they have experienced very little development, very little improvement in their standard of living. And although the Mexican economy, if you look at the overall statistics, you will see that there's been incredible growth. What you find is that the growth in the rural area has been in the hands of a few rather prosperous growers, or to use a modern term, in the hands of agribusiness. And then in the cities, there's also been extreme growth, but concentrated in the hands of multinational investors. And this is another shot, again, in the hometown of Zapata, kind of symbolic of the fact that even though the revolution began here, so many of the rural peasantry has been left behind, and people exist at a very, very low level of income and low technology.
Are these people mostly Indians?
In this particular area, they were Indians in the last century. Mexico has a rather unique way of looking at Indians, that if you adopt modern ways of living, you're no longer considered an Indian. So the ancestors here were, in fact, Indians. And again, here you can see an ox cart. Very typical scene in some parts of Mexico, and yet this coexists beside the very modern agribusiness, which looks almost exactly like agribusiness in Southern California, with your large irrigation and your modern tractors and the like.
Okay, next slide.
And here you can see someone making adobe. Again, this is very typical of so many people in rural Mexico who, as Dick mentioned, the statistics on unemployment and employment are very imprecise, because you have someone like this who might work for a couple of days a week making adobe bricks, and his annual cash income might be $100 if he's lucky. And so you have so many marginal people like this, which is starting to give you an idea of where this tremendous flow of people coming up to the United States starts from. You have people in Mexico in rural areas that are either totally unemployed or living at a very, very low economic level. And so, especially as the population has increased, you now have more unemployed landless peasants than you did at the time of the Mexican Revolution. These peasants begin to leave the countryside after spending generations there in extreme poverty. They leave the countryside, sometimes after having continued to fight for their rights, and they come either to the cities or to the United States, as we have seen in so many cases.
Phil, do you have any figures on if there's an increase of people coming to the United States now? If there's more immigrant workers, maybe Dick has some figures. Has there been an increase in this? Is there increased poverty now in Mexico, increased unemployment that's caused an increase in migration, or is there a sort of decrease? or leveling off?
There's really two big guessing games in Mexico. One is the percentage of unemployed Mexicans, and the other is how many people come to the United States. And so much of what we know about how many Mexicans come to the United States is how many agents the INS sends out in the field. And if they decide they want to arrest maids in El Paso, the statistics for unemployed Mexicans coming to the United States goes up. And so we really know very, very little.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the constant theme of all the scholars who specialize in studying undocumented workers in this country, is that we really have very little idea how many come, and the statistics are pretty much based on who gets caught, and that's more of a political and an economic issue.
Fine.
There's a point here I think that should be made to strengthen what Philip is saying. If an American tourist goes to Mexico, and especially to Mexico City, what he sees is an urban democracy and all of the luxuries of developed countries and so on. And they say, well, this is Mexico. You have to get away from the tourist centers to see rural Mexico, and even then you have to figure out how many people are in the cities and in the country. The government claims it's about 60-40, with the majority being urban. The government counts anyone who lives in a town of 2,500 or more as being an urban resident.
Mm-hmm.
A town of 2,500 or more would have maybe 700 adults. These are rural people. I don't know what a closer figure would be, but it's my estimate that it's probably 50-50 anyway. So when you talk about rural Mexico, it's not like talking about the rural United States. You're talking about half the country.
And you're also talking about incredible gaps between rich and poor and development and underdevelopment, which we'll probably get to later. Go ahead, Phil. Your slides.
This is just one example of what you see in rural Mexico, which is a very strong influence of city corporations which bring in their wares and often have very, very little to do with improving the lives of the people living there. These calendars are advertising soft drinks and beer and present a model which is totally out of keeping with the life of the rural Mexican. I took this picture in an Indian village, and here you have a little blonde kid. And again, the multinational advertising and their products are just totally out of touch with the reality of existence in rural Mexico, and yet the multinationals have found that with that approach they can maximize their profits. And so not only do the people become poor, but they are taught to drink Coca-Cola because that's more sophisticated than drinking orange juice.
This is the model for advertising throughout Mexico, the Great White Hope, using these white gringo models, which seems ludicrous, but it's just trying to get them into consumerism through identification with gringo ideals. Curious.
Yeah, here you can see, as Dick will tell you in a few minutes, that there's a tremendous potential for violence in rural Mexico. There has been relatively little change simply because people are unorganized, and the Mexican government is extremely effective at first co-opting protest or secondly suppressing it. This is just one example where the town rebelled against the mayor. Mayors, as are all political officials in Mexico, are appointed, and then the vote is carried out by the people who vote for the appointed candidate. And in this particular little town in the state of Tlaxcala, the people rebelled and drove out their mayor, and yet they were completely unorganized, they were unarmed, and so if this type of protest ever continues, the Mexican government simply sends in the army, and that's the end of it. And as of yet, there has been no widespread rural opposition to the government, so they can deal with any opposition on a piecemeal basis. And rural protest quite often spills in to urban areas. And here you can see one example of peasants who come into Mexico protesting the many grievances. They have lack of land, they're poor, they don't have jobs, they've been lied to by the government literally for generations. The Mexican agrarian reform supposedly started in 1915, and each Mexican president who's come along has promised people land, and yet the land in many cases has stayed in the hands of big landowners. And so people protest generally rather ineffectively, but we'll see now some more protests from Dick. We have some pictures here. And
well, before we go into that, let's have a little background on this. This is a very fascinating story. Dick, could you tell us how you made contact with these revolutionary guerrillas in Mexico
There has been now for at least since about 1970. Since about 1970, the left-wing movement in Mexico has been growing. It was practically closeted before that. And it has developed an armed wing. There are terrorists of 16 different stripes in Mexico. And there are a few organizations which I regard as more literate, which organize peasants to seize land and arm them. One of these organizations, which is now called the PPM, the Proletarian Party of Mexico, had a representative and a member and a founder in San Antonio, Mario Cantu, a restaurant owner there, who knew the people who formed the PPM before they had formed it. When they formed it, he joined. Mario was frequently implicated in gun-running affairs, and I went to him and said, look, I want to do a story about you and the guerrillas. It took about 6 months to win their confidence. He had to go to Mexico twice, and he was on federal probation at the time and wasn't supposed to leave San Antonio.
He went federal probation?
Oh, yes, he was. And
for gun running? Or?
No, this time for a charge known as shielding illegal aliens. He had interfered with an immigration raid. But he went to Mexico and met with the guerrillas. Their leaders are all in hiding and are wanted, and set up for me to go down. Then I went down, and there were some snafus. But the first time, I spent a while with them in August of '77. Mario and I went together in January of '78 and in October of '78. And his probation office subsequently tried to revoke his probation. And he fled to Europe. He's now living in Madrid, where he's agitating with some other Mexican exiles around the question of the relationship of the United States to Mexico.
Well, that's quite a story.
Then you actually went into the mountains with the...
No, 3 times I have been.
What were some of your experiences there?
Well, my general impression is this, that in rural Mexico, democracy has never existed. What you have there is a rule by force. The big landlords shoot anybody who gives them trouble. And the small peasants, if they lose their land or want more land, resort to arms to get it, because the government is, practically speaking, absent. They petition for land. I've talked to people who are waiting 35 years for a land grant. So you've got an armed, Wild West type society in some sections of those hills.
Where the peasants are actually seizing land with guns forcibly.
Yes.
Is that, where
Yes.
are some of the regions where this has taken place?
Well, in the Sierra Juarez of Oaxaca and in Veracruz. There's been quite a bit in Michoacan. There's been some by other organizations, practically anywhere in rural Mexico.
What was going on in the Sonora region, more in the north? There were some articles in Mother Jones about a movement of peasants there to expropriate land from absentee landlords.
This was at the end of the Echeverria term. And it's never been clear in my mind, Philip may know better than I do, whether or not, in fact, the PRI may have supported that movement. But that region is one in which there's a great deal of truck farming. They farm export crops and export them to the United States. Oddly enough, Mexico's importing beans and wheat and most other staples. But the peasants seized the land, and they declared that it was illegally owned because the tracts were too big, or bigger than what's allowed.
Well, there has been land reform in the past. How was this carried out, if at all, and what's the status of it now?
You get showcase land reform is what I've seen. Philip knows much more about what it's been statistically than I have.
Yeah, about 3 million people have actually received land somewhere along the line. The president that passed out by far the most land was Lázaro Cárdenas in the late 30s, who really made an honest effort at reform, seeing the situation in Mexico as being politically explosive. He made a lot of far-reaching reforms, just like Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in this country at the same time. He broke up a lot of big estates, gave land to the peasants, but since then, the agrarian reform has become more and more of a political sham. Agribusiness has become richer and richer, and increasingly the land that is given to the peasants and broadcast so widely as a measure of justice by the revolution, is really land that is totally worthless, and yet they pass out millions and millions of acres of it, and that brings up very impressive statistics. But very noticeably lacking has been credit and technical aid and anything to make this land productive and to improve the lot of the people who do in fact receive it.
Well, Cardenas also took over the oil industry, nationalized it, did he not?
Yes.
And now Mexico has its own Pemex national. How does this fit in with the multinational oil company framework and the OPEC situation?
Well, I'll backtrack a little bit. Mexico was the world's second largest producer of oil back in the early 20s and the world's largest exporter. It was sort of the Saudi Arabia of the world back then. But by the late 1930s, 1938 to be exact, when Cardenas nationalized the oil, production was down to 5% of what it had been, which is to say that the American and British oil companies there had pretty much pumped the fields dry that they knew about. Since then, and especially in the last couple of years, they have located tremendous new finds which are undoubtedly going to change the whole reality of Mexico and the reality of Mexican-U.S. relations. We simply don't know yet a lot of the basic answers which are going to tell us where things are going. Given the track record of the PRI, though, it doesn't bode very well for the vast majority of the Mexican population. Generally, development by the PRI has been very much oriented toward business interests and pretty much left the average worker out of the picture and not produce good conditions for living.
By the PRI, what do you mean?
The PRI is the Revolutionary Institutional Party, the basic party of the revolution.
Phil, I'm still a bit puzzled. Granting what you said is correct about PRI being basically in the interests of the industrialists and landowners and not the workers, still, what will the government do with those vast profits that supposedly will be coming out of the oil fields? Do you think there'll be graft and corruption in the government? Do you think the investment will be for mainly big business and capital, or do you think there'll be a spillover to genuine projects of social reform that might help the people in the country?
Yeah, undoubtedly there's going to be some spillover, and there'll be some people who didn't have jobs before who will in fact get jobs. But if you just look at the history of oil development in the 20th century, there's no country or region in the world that has used its oil wealth to eliminate poverty and bring about social justice. And that, of course, goes for Texas, which has had tremendous oil development in the last generation.